Operation Twilight Line, Level Design Showcase. Introduction. What if a level could tell a story without a single line of dialogue? In Operation Twilight Line, my goal wasn't just to build a playable space, but to design an experience where the environment itself becomes the storyteller. Every detail is placed with intention, guiding the player naturally without relying on explicit instruction. Setting and co-intention. This level is set during the fall of France, in a quiet countryside village surrounded by rolling hills, overlooking a distant chateau and a damaged church lined with gravestones. From the very beginning, the player is given a safe vantage point, allowing them to observe, plan, and understand the space ahead. This moment creates a sense of calm and control, encouraging the player to think about their route before stepping into danger. The design focuses on guiding the player through emotion rather than traditional UI markers, using the environment itself to lead the experience. Influences. Fans of Sniper Elite, Battlefield 5 War Stories, Hell Let Loose, Sudden Strike 4, Road to Dunkirk and Medal of Honor Frontline, that is players who enjoy tactical shooters with narrative depth. Final level design and justification. Final stage of my level design process as a level designer, that the player experiences of all of the beats, experiences and emotions that I want them to have for this level demo for the Operation Twilight Line. The player looks towards the church and the chateau by using a bit of cover so the player can see it in the distance and feel like they need to get there to progress through the level. Player feel a bit safe just before going down to the church area below as likewise as privileged perspective. As the player progresses through the level, they will use caution before going down so the player should feel vulnerable when exploring the area. Next, the player starts in the speed and forward motion by going down, but the player isn't able to climb back up, as this is where I want the player to feel overwhelmed and trapped as they have to move forward, such as this is called one-way valve. In this section, the player starts moving forward as a speed and forward motion, that the player must run over the wood plates that join onto the rooftop. If the player falls down, the player will slide down onto the different levels of platforms. For the visual aspect, this is likewise muddy like slipping down onto it. Then the player is able to jump up if the player falls down, so they are able to climb back up if the player falls down. When the player uses the speed and forward motion. For this section, the player starts moving forward as a speed and forward motion, that the player must run over the wood plates that join onto the rooftop. The player looks towards the church in the middle of the village in the distance, as well as the chateau to the right of the church. After that, the player moves towards the church by jumping down in the gap between the building below. When the player in the building feels a bit safe, like above is very dangerous, the player might get shot at and the player needs to keep moving down in between the gap. As well, this is called discoverability, and a bit of freedom and a bit calmer for the player. When the player moves around the house, the player is able to see the church in the distance, such as this is called privileged perspective. So the player can see the church, as this is the branching by target, as a present a clear objective for the player. On the door is being blocked, so the player have to move the box to able to jump on to get on like the funnel before reveal. The player jumps down to the ground. The player looks around the area by using a bit of caution, where the player now feels a bit nervous or scared to move on. After the player looks more left, this is where the player sees a big funnel before revealing to present a clear objective with numbers of ways of illusion of choices. The player still feels nervous when going through the trees. After that, the player sees a wooden cart that interact with by pushing it to the correct placement next to some boxes that goes to the next area across the rooftop. Originally placed for the wooden cart mechanic system. By pushing the cart to the correct placement by pressing a button, the player will be able to move next to the boxes. Then the player will be able to jump on it. With the wooden cart, it happens the player as this achievement for the player as to able to jump on the roof. When the player jumps on the roof, the experience is goals for the player to achieve by having a clear objectives, such as the player sees the church and the chateau. There's might have some shortcuts that are not visible from ground level, as well as the player feels a bit confused now, as there are different choices to make for the next screenshots. For this section where the player are a bit confused, that is creating tension in the player journey, and try to find where to go, a village that has been blocking the viewpoint of the church by the building is in the way. The player is still a bit confused, but decides to follow the path that leads to next area. This looks like a shortcut, but this bait and switch as the red herring has been achieved. So the player have to turn around and find the real path to the next area. When the player achieves the real pathway, then the player feels scared as it is with a trench with a pillbox at the end of it. The player can choose to go through the trench or go around it via the long grass area to the right of the trench. If the player chooses to go through the trench, then they will be likely to be shot at by the pillbox. The player crouches as using caution in this area, as the player if standing up the German might shoot at them. As well, the church is in the background, so the player can know where to go next. When the player reaches the barn, continuing on to the next beat of the level. Old houses being damages as my focus in this section, that the player feels more scared and should feel vulnerable when exploring the area. While using the covers of the old broken building, the player sees a road with the trucks on it in the background as well. Then the player started running in the open, where the player must cross the road as a motivated movement that goes forwards to the checkpoint. With the abandoned French trucks, pillbox as the player feels vulnerable that must have a choice to run across the area without being shot at while using the French trucks as cover. The player goes into the trench. With twists and turns as the player feels more vulnerable if the player stand up he would be shoot at. While the player start running toward to the entrance of the church area. When the player goes throughout the gates that has been the entrance of the church, the player feels a bit worried that I might get shoot here. While the player goes towards the church entrance, the doors is closed, so the player runs out, and then look toward or without going toward the next sector of the level as a feeling that I must goes to. The player feels a bit calmer, but the church is being somewhat blocked or closed, so the player must goes to the next sector. The player looks towards the fence area, and then the player goes out of the gates and towards the metal fence that is easy to access at the back of the church. The player jumps over the fence to get to the next area of the level, as this is quite tense as this is the next best pacing of the game, and the player needs to know that. After the player does that, the player goes to the side of the church and finds out there is a door that is an achievement for the player that has been discoverable. The player now achieved by going upstairs towards the chateau. The player goes to the top of the stairs that goes upstairs towards the church tower. In the future development, ideally the lighting shows there is some candles that shows the player goes up to the top of the tower. It has privileged view in place where it has a vantage point, which is focused the player overlook and to able to see ahead of the potential pathways toward the chateau, so the player taken into account by able to see the objective from a safe vantage point before beginning the mission. In the section the player feels safe whilst planning their route before feeling vulnerable when they decide to begin, as well as reveal information through new perspectives. There are some pathways that might have some shortcuts that are not visible from ground level. This is where the player can see the chateau from a vantage point, as this is the branching point for the player to choose their route, but some pathways might have some shortcuts that are not visible from this point of view. Now the player knows where to go by going back downstairs. When the player goes around the back of the church, they can see the chateau. With trees in the way they can't see the path to the chateau yet. There are some pathways that might have some shortcuts, but they are not visible. Then the player sees a road that the Germans might be taken on in the middle of the tree line. While in cover, the player motivation to run down as to get toward to the next cover point. Then the player sees some French trucks on the bridge, but is blocked and unable to access it. The player can turn around while using the wall as cover. When the player must jump, as this is called a motive movement by jumping over the platforms, as the river is too deep and the riverbank is too high to climb as well. Plus, the gaps in between the bridges that the German sniper might shoot at you if you try to climb on the bridge. When the player reached to the end of the platform, in the future development of the game, the player will be able to semi-explore this area, as this is a garden area with a lot of bushes, trees, and plants. This is ending of the demo of the blockout for Operation Twilight Line. In the full version of the game, it will be further refined where it's have more narrative and gameplay elements that will be added into it, such as roads that goes to somewhere else and more details on the environment that will make the player more immersive and engaging. Also, the player will have more interaction with the chateau. As well, the Germans comes to the chateau, and the player will have to escape the chateau before the Germans arrived. About guiding the player through emotion rather than instruction. By combining environment, architecture, and gameplay systems, the goal was to create a world that players don't just play, but feel. Because the best stories in games are the ones you discover yourself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more exciting updates from a world of Operation Twilight Line. See you next time.